The hands of the killer, Jesse Joseph Tafaro, were strapped tightly to the armrests of the electric chair. In just a second, a charge of about 2,000 volts was supposed to surge through his body, instantly stopping his heart. But then, something went horribly wrong. The machine malfunctioned. Instead of a quick death, Tafaro burst into flames, screaming in agony. It took 3 more jolts of electricity to finally end his suffering. The most horrifying part is that later, it was revealed that he was innocent. What makes this even more chilling is the friendly nickname of that very same chair, Old Sparky. In Florida alone, it was used to execute 239 people. And while most states have banned the electric chair, the death penalty itself is still legal, not just in the US, but worldwide. Yet, is it really humane? And why do some countries still use brutal methods of execution? Let's dive in and find out. As always, viewer discretion is advised. Riverbend Maximum Security Institution, Nashville, Tennessee. Philip Workman was still asleep in the death house, the cell where inmates are taken 24 hours before their execution. Yet, how did he end up here? Philip was addicted to illegal substances, and when he ran out of money, he decided to take a desperate risk. Armed, he stormed into a local Wendy's demanding cash from the register. Later, he was sentenced to death. As of today, the death penalty is still legal in 27 states. But wait, do people really get executed for robbing a fast food place? Of course not. The death penalty is typically reserved for crimes like treason, espionage, large-scale drug trafficking, and murder. In Philip's case, during his escape with the stolen money, he lethally shot a police lieutenant, Ronald Oliver, who was trying to stop him. In many U.S. states, including Tennessee, killing a police officer is considered an aggravating factor, one that almost automatically makes the crime worthy of the death penalty, as it's seen as a direct threat to the state itself. U.S. law allows several execution methods: the electric chair, firing squad, nitrogen asphyxiation using a special mask, and lethal injection. Gas chambers and hanging are also still technically allowed, although all states consider them outdated and impractical. The last time a gas chamber was used was in 1999. Almost 20 years later, Alabama introduced an alternative, nitrogen asphyxiation, where the inmate breathes pure nitrogen until they suffocate. State officials claim it's the most painless and humane execution method known to humankind. Yet after the very first execution using this method of convicted murderer Kenneth Smith, the European community was outraged. A spokesperson for the EU called this method particularly cruel and unusual punishment, especially since Kenneth had already gone through a failed execution attempt back in November, 2 years earlier. I'll get to that a bit later. Don't worry. Now, hanging is even more interesting. The last U.S. state to abolish it was New Hampshire. More specifically, in 2019, the state banned the death penalty altogether. But prisoners who were already on death row before the law passed can still be executed. However, for Philip, the chosen method was the most common execution method in the U.S., lethal injection. 15 hours before the injection, Philip was woken up and given a standard prison breakfast, usually some oatmeal, an egg, and toast. 14 hours before execution, inmates are allowed to see their loved ones and are given 45 minutes for final phone calls. 12 hours before execution, inmates are served lunch and allowed to confess to a priest. In 2019, an unusual case made headlines. A Buddhist inmate, Patrick Murphy, sued the state of Texas for refusing to allow a Buddhist spiritual advisor into the execution chamber, while Christian and Muslim chaplains were permitted. His execution was delayed, and shortly after, Texas banned all spiritual advisors from being present during executions, claiming it was to ensure equal treatment for all religions. One last request for the condemned is their final meal, which is served 6 hours before the execution. There's a common misconception that they can order anything, yet the budget is capped at $30, which, given today's prices, isn't really much at all. Researcher Ashley Lecker, in her work, The Serial Killer's Cookbook, found that the most common last meal requests from death row inmates are fried chicken, steaks, and pies. However, do you know what killers' absolute favorite food is? Ice cream. Around 80% of inmates chose it. One request that stood out, though, came from the killer, Robert Buell, who asked for just one black olive. On the other hand, Gary Carl Simmons Jr. ordered a meal totaling 29,000 calories, but he couldn't even finish it all. Philip Workman was one of the few inmates who refused the last meal altogether. Instead, he wanted to do something a little more honorable. He asked the officers to donate a vegetarian pizza to the homeless. The prison staff told him this wasn't part of the protocol. When the community learned about his request, they started ordering and delivering pizzas to the homeless. Unfortunately, Phil probably never knew. He was already being led to his execution. Meanwhile, outside the prison, people were protesting. There were suspicions that the police officer had been accidentally shot by another officer. During the investigation, even Phil himself claimed he had agreed to the sentence under pressure. Still, no one overturned the verdict. Workman was given a lethal injection consisting of 3 drugs, an anesthetic for pain relief, a paralyzing agent to stop his breathing, and a toxic substance that causes the heart to stop. Ideally, the person passes away painlessly within minutes. Workman was lucky that everything went according to plan. That doesn't always happen though. 1906, St. Paul, Minnesota, USA. William Williams, convicted of murdering his young lover and her mother, was awaiting his execution in the basement of the Ramsey County Jail. At that time, hanging was a common method of execution. In movies about older times, you've probably seen execution like these taking place in public squares, almost like a spectacle. Even in more restrained settings, it still looks inhumane. Williams was brought to the gallows. A rope was placed around his neck, and the trap door was opened beneath him. Suddenly, the condemned man fell through the trap door and slammed hard onto the floor below. The rope the sheriff had prepared turned out to be too long. The sheriff's assistants, stunned, rushed to the body and had to forcefully pull him up to complete the execution. It took a full 14 minutes, during which Williams writhed in his death agony. Everyone present was shocked by such a horrific sight. This botched execution sparked outrage among the public, but Minnesota abolished the death penalty only 5 years later. However, it remained in effect in other states. Mississippi, 1983. Jimmy Lee Gray, convicted of the horrific murder of a 3-year-old girl, was set to be executed in the gas chamber. When the inmate was locked in and the lethal gas was released, instead of blacking out immediately, he began groaning and gasping for air. It was so horrifying that everyone in the observation room left. No one intervened. It's said you could hear him banging his head against the metal pole until, finally, silence fell. His execution lasted 8 minutes, which felt like an eternity. This incident led Mississippi to completely abandon the gas chamber. Yet despite all of this, similar failed executions continue to occur in other states. McAllister, Oklahoma, 2014. Clayton Lockett, convicted of the brutal murder of a young woman, was sentenced to a lethal injection. However, instead of administering the injection straight away, the execution team struggled for an hour to find a vein for the drug. Eventually, they succeeded, and the inmate closed his eyes and tilted his head back. Suddenly, Lockett regained consciousness, started groaning, and said something was wrong. He tried to break free from the straps that were holding him down. The staff was so stunned that they decided to halt the execution. However, 43 minutes later, Lockett passed away from a heart attack, enduring excruciating pain. And this wasn't the only case where something went wrong during the injection process. In Florence, in 2014, Joseph Wood wasn't killed immediately by the standard drug dose, so they injected him with another 14 doses, even though that's forbidden. Suddenly, Wood began gasping and sniffling, and eventually, he died in convulsions over the course of 2 hours. For the same reason, Kenneth Smith's execution couldn't be carried out, which led to the decision to test a new method: nitrogen asphyxiation. These horrific events became another argument against the death penalty, which continues to spark debates worldwide. However, such practices still exist, and some countries have their own unique features that might surprise you. Tokyo, July 9, 2022. Tomohiro Kato was led to his hanging, marking the culmination of one of the most notorious crimes in modern Japanese history. 14 years ago, Kato intentionally drove a truck into a crowd in the popular Akihabara district. After hitting several people, he exited the vehicle and began attacking pedestrians with a knife. A total of 7 people were killed and 10 more were injured. Before this horrific incident, Kato had posted on online forums expressing his frustration about having no friends and feeling abandoned by society. Later, he claimed that his life had no meaning and that his actions were a protest. For such a heinous crime, Kato was sentenced to death. The unique feature of this process in Japan is that only a few witnesses are allowed: the prosecutor, prison officials, and a doctor. The family of the condemned is notified about the execution only after it has been carried out. I looked at the publication dates of articles about this sensational execution in the country, and they were indeed published only a few weeks after it took place. Still, when I was searching for information about executions in different countries, one of the most shocking methods of execution is the use of death vans in China. China is indeed known for its high number of executions each year, with estimates suggesting over 1,000 people are sentenced to death annually. China allows fewer types of executions than the US. These are shootings and lethal injections. Nonetheless, the punishment is carried out in an unconventional way. The death van arrives at the place where the prisoner is held. They are brought out and locked inside. Then the prisoner is secured to a special bed and an injection is administered, which quickly leads to death. After the execution, the body is usually cremated and the relatives are informed about the execution of the sentence. But the highest execution rate per capita is still in Singapore. In the last 30 years, over 400 people have been executed here, mostly by hanging. With a population of 5.7 million, this is an extremely high rate. If you calculate, it is 43 times higher than the number of death row inmates in the USA. Here, inmates are only notified about their execution 1 to 2 hours before it takes place. I don't even know what's better, waiting for death for years or finding out suddenly. In my opinion, though, the most terrifying and least humane execution methods are used in Somalia. It's a country where executions are still carried out publicly, even besides hanging, shooting, or even stoning. It sounds somewhat barbaric to me. I believe the guilty should be punished, yet we shouldn't become like the killers ourselves by turning just as cruel. Don't you think? In any case, every year an average of 13 people are executed in Somalia. However, there are several dictatorial countries where the death penalty still looks like torture from past centuries. Kong Chal-won, a North Korean defector who fled to China and then to South Korea, once told journalists about one of the executions in his dictatorial homeland. He himself wasn't present at this horrifying spectacle, but some witnesses told him the story. It was 2018. A crowd gathered to witness another public punishment of culprits. Suddenly, there was the roar of massive guns. In front of them stood 2 prisoners. Their mouths were literally filled with pieces of iron to add more agony to their execution. One horrifying moment, and they were already lying dead on the ground. At that moment, red stains appeared on the clothing of Kim Jong-un's uncle, Jang Song-taek. This caused shock and even stunned those watching the event with a certain indifference up until that point. Interestingly, he himself later became a victim of the regime and was executed using the same anti-aircraft gun. However, this was only the beginning of a purge. In the following months, all of Zhang's relatives, including children, were executed, and in truly barbaric ways. Some were burned alive with flamethrowers, while others were torn apart by dogs. These actions were initiated by Kim Jong-un, who claimed they were meant to eliminate potential threats to his power. Is it only North Korea that is known for such cruelty? Let's take a look at Saudi Arabia. Every year, over 185 people are executed here, and the list of crimes punishable by death is astonishingly broad. From theft to apostasy, the methods are no less shocking. Shooting, stoning, and even beheading. The latter is carried out using a yataghan, a large curved sword, and is often a public spectacle as well. Mohammed Saeed al-Bashi, Saudi Arabia's chief executioner, proudly executes these sentences. In his interviews, he states that this is God's will. His children even help him maintain the sword, keeping it sharp as a razor. Even harsher laws still exist in Iraq. After the overthrow of Saddam Hussein's regime, the death penalty was reinstated in Iraq. It is most often handed down to militants and political enemies. The execution process is strikingly fast. It usually takes place immediately after the first official trial, and the condemned are not given sufficient time to appeal or reconsider the verdict. Executions are carried out by hanging, typically in public. However, cruelty is not confined to the East. In Europe, Belarus remains the only country where the death penalty is still in use. The death row cells here are true rooms of torture. Inmates are forbidden from lying or sitting in their beds during non-working hours, and the execution date is kept secret. On the day of the verdict, the condemned is led out, blindfolded, made to kneel, and then executed with a single pull of the trigger. Here, families can also learn of the death of a loved one only weeks later. These examples show that the cruelty of dictatorial regimes knows no geographical boundaries. Human life becomes nothing more than a tool for fear and manipulation. It still leaves me wondering. On one hand, I understand the argument that a killer deserves punishment. But do they really? And does our opinion even matter in this debate? On January 21st, 2025, Donald Trump already signed an executive order reinstating the death penalty at the federal level. This means he now requires the government to encourage its enforcement in all states, even those that have long abandoned such practices. Let me know your thoughts in the comments and subscribe to my channel, as there are many more controversial topics I'd like to discuss with you.